Today's reading is from Martin Heidegger, lderlin and the Essence of Poetry from Existence and Being. This is Part 2, Section 4. This saying forms the conclusion of the poem Remembrance, and runs, quote, "But that which remains is established by the poets." This saying throws light on our question about the essence of poetry. Poetry is the act of establishing by the word and in the word. What is established in this manner? The permanent. But can the permanent be established then? Is it not that which has always been present? No. Even the permanent must be fixed so that it will not be carried away. The simple must be wrested from confusion. Proportion must be set before what lacks proportion. That which supports and dominates the existent in its entirety must become manifest. Being must be opened out so that the existent may appear. But this very permanent is the transitory. Thus, swiftly passing is everything heavenly, but not in vain. But that this should remain is, quote, entrusted to the poets as a care and a service. The poet names the gods and names all things in that which they are. This naming does not consist merely in something already known being supplied with a name. It is rather that when the poet speaks the essential word, the existent is by this naming nominated as what it is. So it becomes known as existent. Poetry is the establishing of being by means of the word. Hence that which remains is never taken from the transitory. The simple can never be picked out immediately from the intricate. Proportion does not lie in what lacks proportion. We never find the foundation in what is bottomless. Being is never inexistent. But, because being and essence of things can never be calculated and derived from what is present, they must be freely created, laid down, and given. Such an act of giving is establishment. But when the gods are named originally and the essence of things receives a name, so that things for the first time shine out, human existence is brought into a firm relation and given a basis. The speech of the poet is establishment not only in the sense of the free act of giving, but at the same time in the sense of the firm basing of human existence on its foundation. If we conceive this essence of poetry as the establishing of being by means of the word, then we can have some inkling of the truth of that saying which lderlin spoke long after he had been received into the protection of the night of lunacy. 5. We find this fifth pointer in the long and at the same time monstrous poem which begins, "In the lovely azure there flowers with its metallic roof the church tower." Here, lderlin says, full of merit, and yet poetically, dwells man on this earth. What man works at and pursues is through his own endeavors earned and deserved. Yet, says lderlin in sharp antithesis, all this did not touch the essence of his sojourn on this earth. All this did not reach the foundation of human existence. The latter is fundamentally poetic. But we now understand poetry as the inaugural naming of the gods and of the essence of things. To dwell poetically means to stand in the presence of the gods and to be involved in the proximity of the essence of things. Existence is poetical in its fundamental aspect, which means at the same time, insofar as it is established, founded, it is not a recompense, but a gift. Poetry is not merely an ornament accompanying existence, not merely a temporary enthusiasm or nothing but an interest and amusement. Poetry is the foundation which supports history, and therefore it is not a mere appearance of culture, and absolutely not the mere expression of a cultured soul. That our existence is fundamentally poetic, this cannot in the last resort mean that it is really only a harmless game. But does not lderlin himself, in the first pointer which we quoted, call poetry, quote, that most innocent of all occupations. How can this be reconciled with the essence of poetry as we are now revealing it? This brings us back to the question which we laid aside in the first instance. In now proceeding to answer this question, we will try at the same time to summarize and bring before the inner eye the essence of poetry and of the poet. First of all, it appeared that the field of action of poetry is language. Hence, the essence of poetry must be understood through the essence of language. Afterwards, it became clear that poetry is the inaugural naming of being and of the essence of all things, not just any speech, but that particular kind which, for the first time, brings into the open all that which we then discuss and deal with in everyday language. Hence, poetry never takes language as a raw material ready to hand. Rather, it is poetry which first makes language possible. Poetry is the primitive language of a historical people. Therefore, in just the reverse manner, the essence of language must be understood through the essence of poetry. The foundation of human existence is conversation, in which language does truly become actual. But primitive language is poetry, in which being is established. Yet language is the most dangerous of possessions. Thus poetry is the most dangerous work, and at the same time the most innocent of all occupations. In fact, it is only if we combine these two definitions and conceive of them as one that we fully comprehend the essence of poetry. But is poetry then truly the most dangerous work? In a letter to a friend, immediately before leaving on his last journey to France, lderlin writes, "O friend, the world lies before me brighter than it was, and more serious. I feel pleasure at how it moves onward. I feel pleasure when in summer the ancient Holy Father with calm hand shakes lightnings of benediction out of the rosy clouds. For amongst all that I can perceive of God, this sign has become for me the chosen one. I used to be able to exult over a new truth, a better insight into that which is above us and around us. Now I am frightened lest in the end it should happen with me as with Tantalus of old, who received more from the gods than he was able to digest." The poet is exposed to the divine lightnings. This is spoken of in the poem which we must recognize as the purest poetry about the essence of poetry, which begins, "When on festive days a countryman goes to gaze on his field in the morning." There, the last stanza says, "Yet it behooves us, under the storms of God, ye poets, with uncovered head to stand, with our own hand to grasp the very lightning flash, paternal, and to pass, wrapped in song, the divine gift to the people." A year later, when he had returned to his mother's house, struck down with madness, lderlin wrote to the same friend, recalling his stay in France. "The mighty element, the fire of heaven and the stillness of men, their life amid nature, and their limitation and contentment, have constantly seized me, and, as it is told of the heroes, I can truly say that I have been struck by Apollo." The excessive brightness has driven the poet into the dark. Is any further evidence necessary as to the extreme danger of his occupation? The very destiny itself of the poet tells everything. The passage in Hölderlin's Empedocles rings like a premonition. He through whom the Spirit speaks must leave betimes. And nevertheless, poetry is the most innocent of all occupations. Hölderlin writes this effect in his letter, not only in order to spare his mother, but because he knows that this innocent fringe belongs to the essence of poetry, just as the valley does to the mountain. For how could this most dangerous work be carried out and preserved if the poet were not cast out? Empedocles 3. from everyday life and protected against it by the apparent harmlessness of his occupation. Poetry looks like a game, and yet it is not. A game does indeed bring men together, but in such a way that each forgets himself in the process. In poetry, on the other hand, man is reunited on the foundation of his existence. There he comes to rest, not indeed to the seeming rest of inactivity and emptiness of thought, but to that infinite state of rest in which all powers and relations are active. See the letter to his brother, dated 1st of January, 1799. Poetry rouses the appearance of the unreal and of dream in the face of the palpable and clamorous reality in which we believe ourselves at home. And yet in just the reverse manner, what the poet says and undertakes to be is the real. So Panthea, with the clairvoyance of a friend, declares of Empedocles, that he himself should be, is what is life, and the rest of us are dreams of it. So in the very appearance of its outer fringe, the essence of poetry seems to waver, and yet stands firm. In fact, it is itself essentially establishment, that is to say, an act of firm foundation. Yet every inaugural act remains a free gift, and Heidegger hears it said, "Let poets be free as swallows." But this freedom is not undisciplined arbitrariness and capricious desire, but supreme necessity. Poetry, as the act of establishing being, is subject to a twofold control. In considering these integral laws, we first grasp the essence entire. The writing of poetry is the fundamental naming of the gods. But the poetic word only acquires its power of naming when the gods themselves bring us to language. How do the gods speak? And signs to us from antiquity are the language of the gods. The speech of the poet is the intercepting of these signs in order to pass them on to his own people. This intercepting is an act of receiving, and yet at the same time a fresh act of giving, for in the first signs the poet catches sight already of the completed message, and his word boldly presents what he has glimpsed, so as to tell in advance of the not yet fulfilled. So, quote, "The bold spirit like an eagle before the tempest flies prophesying in the path of his advancing gods." The establishment of being is bound to the signs of the gods, and at the same time the poetic word is only the interpretation of the voice of the people. This is how lderlin names the sayings in which a people remembers that it belongs to the totality of all that exists. But often this voice grows dumb and weary. In general even, it is not capable of saying of itself what is true, but has need of those who explain it. The poem which bears the title Voice of the People has been handed down to us in two versions. It is above all the concluding stanzas which are different, but the difference is such that they supplement one another. In the first version, the ending runs, "Because it is pious, I honor for love of the heavenly ones the people's voice, the tranquil, yet for the sake of gods and men, may it not always be tranquil too willingly." And the second version is, "And truly, sayings are good, for they are a reminder of the highest, yet something is also needed to explain the holy sayings." In this way, the essence of poetry is joined on to the laws of the signs and is joined on to the laws of the signs of the gods and of the voice of the peoples. In this way, the essence of poetry is joined on to the laws of the signs of the gods and of the voice of the people, laws which tend towards and away from each other. The poet himself stands between the former, the gods, and the latter, the people. He is one who has been cast out into that between gods and men. But only and for the first time in this between is it decided who man is and where he is settling his existence. Quote, poetically, man dwells man upon this earth. Unceasing and ever more securely, out of the fullness of the images pressing about him, and always more simply, did Hölderlin devote his poetic word to this realm of between. And this compels us to say that he is the poet of the poet. Can we continue now to suppose that Hölderlin is entangled in an empty and exaggerated narcissism due to inadequate richness of vision? Or must we recognize that this poet, from an excess of impetus, reaches out with poetic thought into the foundation and the mist of being? It is to Hölderlin himself that we must apply what he has said of Oedipus in the late poem, "In the lovely azure there flowers." King Oedipus has one eye too many, perhaps. Hölderlin writes poetry about the essence of poetry, but not in the sense of a timelessly valid concept. The essence of poetry belongs to a determined time, but not in such a way that it merely conforms to this time, as to one which is already in existence. It is that Hölderlin, in the act of establishing the essence of poetry, first determines a new time. It is the time of the gods that have fled, and of the God that is coming. It is the time of need, but it is the time of need, because it underlies a double lack and a double not. The no more of the gods that have fled, and the not yet of the God that is coming. The essence of poetry, which Hölderlin establishes, is in the highest degree historical, because it anticipates a historical time. But as a historical essence, it is the sole essential essence. This time is needy, and therefore its poet is extremely rich, so rich that he would often like to relax in thoughts of those that have been, and in eager waiting for that which is coming. This time is needy, and therefore its poet is extremely rich, so rich that he would often like to relax in thoughts of those that have been, and in eager waiting for that which is coming, and would like only to sleep in this apparent emptiness. But he holds his ground in the nothing of this night. Whilst the poet remains thus by himself in the supreme isolation of his mission, he fashions truth, vicariously and therefore truly, for his people. The seventh stanza of the elegy Bread and Wine tells of this. What it has only been possible to analyze here intellectually is expressed there poetically. But friend, we come too late. The gods are alive, it is true, but up there above one's head in another world. Eternally they work there and seem to pay little heed to whether we live, so attentive are the heavenly ones. For a weak vessel cannot always receive them, only now and then does man endure divine abundance. Life is a dream of them, but madness helps, like slumber, and strengthens need and night, until heroes enough have grown in the iron cradle. Hearts like as before to the heavenly in power. But madness helps, like some slumber, and strengthens need and night, until heroes enough have grown in the iron cradle, hearts like as before to the heavenly in power. Thundering they come. Meanwhile it often seems better to sleep than to be thus without companions. To wait thus, and in the meantime, what to do and say, I know not, and what use are poets in a time of need? But, thou sayest, they are like the wine god's holy priests, who go from land to land in the holy night,